Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And one of the things here that have concerned us at Varn Blog is the development of moral theory. I have critiqued many on the left for substituting political theory for moral theory and using them interchangeably, not developing a suitable ethical theory, not really dealing with metaethics. And these are all big words, but they have led to me doubling down on things like understanding communitarian virtues, historical theories of virtue ethics, etc. The prime enemy of virtue ethics historically is emotivism. Now, we're going to get into emotivism today because it is the focus of one of the most important books. There are two very important thinkers to get into modern, let's say, Christian and post-Christian virtue ethics. Now, I don't actually subscribe to Christian virtue ethics, and for a variety of reasons, but you do have to kind of understand the theory, not because it's unique to Christianity. It's actually, you see it in a lot of ancient thoughts, but because it's communal embeddedness, the idea of modeling, the idea of traits that are neither deontological or consequential, so they are not seen as things that, like, for example, in classical virtue ethics, you learn virtues both by their value as virtues and by the consequences. So they are strengths which are modeled, that you see in consequences which can be judged. All right. So the deontological consequentialist binary that frames so much metaethical concerns in analytic philosophy, whether or not one's Kantian or a utilitarian or some kind of emotivist, is not, those binaries don't really apply to various historical virtue ethic theories, which humans have largely used. But moral sentimentalism is a particular kind of thing. Emotivism sort of emerges from it. And I agree with Alasdair MacIntyre and Philippa Foot that in some ways, modern liberal individualism, which is one of the few things that we can trace throughout liberalism, all right? Liberalism has become a mess of a concept over time, but the idea that the individual, both as a moral agent and as someone pursuing their happiness, and as someone emerging from a systemic context, but the focus on the individual is something that is pretty ubiquitous to most liberal and post-liberal theories. It is, in my mind, and Alasdair MacIntyre's mind, and we'll go into that in this series, and this is going to be a Varn Blog solo series because I think it has some implications both for the way we think about philosophy and the way we think about politics that make this kind of more crucial than this a kind of, basic meta-ethical lecture. All right. But sentimentalism is kind of the precursor to emotivism, and it emerges roughly in the 16th and 17th century in what would become the beginnings of the analytic tradition. That caused, in some ways, both utilitarianism and deontologicalism from the German idealist school to emerge as an answer to it, although the individual concerns is shared by all three moral traditions in a way that it isn't shared by different kinds of virtue ethics and other ethical systems. All right. Now, emotivism can take the form of a bunch of stuff, and we're going to get into moral sentimentalism and the kind of basic kinds of moral sentimentalism that emerge. We're going to also talk about moral nihilism, moral aestheticism, and non-cognitivism or expressivism today. All right, now these are a bunch of isms. But when we get into dealing into what MacIntyre is complaining about liberality leading to a certain kind of metaethical theory, well, it seems to reason away from emotivism, actually go back to it. That's MacIntyre's primary concern. We kind of need to know what these theories are. So, emotivism, interestingly, kind of comes out of the moral sentiments school, which emerges in response to Bishop George Berkeley in 1710. Because Berkeley thought that language primarily served to inspire feelings as well as communicate ideas, and that this was a basis for morality. Both David Hume and Adam Smith in his other work, we always know him for The Wealth of Nations, but he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But in a 1751 book, Hume wrote An Enquiry Concerning Moral Principles. Hume considered morality is not related to mere facts or mere reasons or prepositions, but was determined by sentiment. And the famous quote is the following: in moral deliberations, we must be acquainted beforehand with all the objects and all the relations to each other. Now, we still have dealings with relationality, but that's going to generally fall away. And from the comparison to the whole, back to the Hume thing, fix our choices with approbation. While we are ignorant to whether man is an aggressor or not, how can we determine whether a person who killed him be a criminal or an innocent? But after every circumstances, every relation is known, the understanding has no further room to operate, nor any object in which it could employ itself. The approbation or blame which then ensues cannot be the work of judgment, but of the heart. And this is not a speculative position or affirmation, but an act of feeling or sentiment. Now, what's interesting about this early sentimentalism is it's actually similar to virtue theory. Like, when you get into Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, for him, virtues and sentiments are related. He's trying to remove sentiments away from facts or propositions that exist in the universe beyond the human, kind of transcendental virtues, into things that can be cultivated as sentimental feelings and affectations that are the grounds of virtue. Now, so far, so good doesn't really seem that pernicious, but one of the things you'll notice about this is that the individual sentiment is taken as the dominant position of moral inquiry. So it is removed from any historical or communal context. Now, I will say that both in Hume and in Smith, there is a focus on relationality, that relations are where this comes from. But as we get into logical positivism's turn in America, we're not talking about early Vienna style logical positivism. We're talking about like A.J. Ayer and C.L. Stevenson, and the particular growth of a kind of return to Kantian analytic philosophy that rejects deontology and also rejects utilitarianism. One gets into a returned emphasis on emotivism. Now, what's interesting about emotivism is that in many ways, the logical positivists reject the sentimentalist concern that human sentiments and emotions, even though they're not facts and are not like abstract reason, are still goods which play into and actually deal with the fact that without sentimental orientations, according to this theory, that humans could not rationally make a distinction between, say, orange cream seltzer and cherry seltzer, because there's no facticity to that other than mere preference that would make the mere preference non-arbitrary. Okay, so, however, let's talk about sentimentalists for a second. So we have this kind of early development out of the British empiricist school of moral sentiments. How does it kind of develop? Well, you can kind of break moral sentimentalism down into three basic broad tendencies. Explanatory sentimentalists, who believe that moral thoughts are fundamentally explained through emotions, and in some ways, this is the David Hume position, that there's no judgment about the goodness or badness about the emotions, but that we can't really come up with reasons to have morality purely from reason. It is not a reasoned debate. Now, this is actually a huge break from both virtue ethics and from natural law and divine command ethics. I'm not going to get into that, but these are sort of the late medieval, early modern views of ethics. So divine command's easy. God told you to, you do it. Natural law is a lot more complicated, goes back to Aquinas, but it's also actually influential in early liberal thinkers and early individualist thinkers, such as early individual social contract thinkers, such as Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke, even though natural law is eventually abandoned for either, in the most part by liberals, either emotivism, but emotivism is seen, by many is seen as too close to nihilism. We'll get to that in a minute. To utilitarianism, which is beyond this purview of this series, and to deontology. All right. So you have explanatory sentimentalists who just say that we can't really judge moral thoughts as having rational content, but that they are fundamentally explained by emotional responses, and these emotional responses are not arbitrary exactly, but not entirely reasoned out. Then there are judgmental sentimentalists who believe that moral judgments are emotional or non-cognitive responses. Now, we're going to talk about non-cognitivism later. This was very popular in analytic and post-logical positivist philosophy in the middle of the 20th century. It basically argued that emotive or affective states do not have moral content the way reasons do, and cannot be said to be cognitive, meaning that you don't reason about them, you feel about them. Now, from our standpoint today, and from the standpoint of modern psychology, the division between cognition and emotion is actually a whole fucking lot thinner than it was for A.J. Auer and the logical positivist. And that's on effectively what we can see as neurological ground. But at the time in the in the 40s and 50s, when this was still seen as a meaningful difference. This kind of emotivism is actually quite rare today, but it was popular when I was in the middle of the 20th century. And frankly, when I was learning about analytic philosophy, I thought it made sense until I started really thinking about how fuzzy the distinction was between kinds of reasons and kinds of sentiments. All right, back to this. And then there's expressivist, who believes that all moral terms can only be accounted for with associated non-cognitive states. So basically, you are expressing an affect. Now, these are all kinds of sentimentalisms. Now, we could break this down even further, talking about moral sense theories, which are largely still coming out of Britain, associated with people like Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl Shaftesbury, um, where you have both first order and second order liking, etc. Um, you can that leads to people like Francis Hutcheson developing this out, and this is called, the theory of moral senses. Um, this actually does have people today um, that hold it. For example, Jonathan Haidt has really been big on resuscitating Hutcheson's moral sense theory. That you know that there are moral senses that actually should be cultivated, like love and compassion, and that they come from intuitions and gut reactions, and that people have them kind of by nature. I mean, Haidt would say genetically. Um, and he's sort of the person picking up moral sense theory today. Um, Other moral sense theory actually have empathy and sympathy based conceptions, and this is actually usually associated with people coming out of the David Hume Adam Smith. Um, they don't they consider moral sympathies to be, and sentiments to be things that generate sympathy. Um, this Most of this theory was really popular in the 16th century, from about 1750 to about 17 into the 1790s. Um, and this does focus on relationality, right? But it's relationality as emotively felt by the individual. Um, it's not a social relationality as such. But this is often picked up by the natural morality people today. So when you meet people who argue that, for example, humans are innately moral and it's based on a sense of fairness, and that fairness is evolved, but that this is based on sympathy and altruism, generally these people are developing under modern auspices a Humean moral sympathy or empathy affect theory of morality. Has the advantage of being relational, but still feels liberal because it focuses on the individual subject. Um, and it is naturalizing. You know, it just says we can't deal with the naturalistic fallacy. For don't know, the naturalistic fallacy is you can't derive an ought from an is. That's Hume as well. And so we can't say that this is, properly speaking, a rational component of human thought because this is naturally developed, but as an empirical claim, this is what they claim the basis of human morality comes from. Now, these are the two basic kinds of explanatory sentimentalist. And generally, these aren't considered emotivism, although when you read someone like Alasdair MacIntyre, he does kind of talk about these people in the same way. And he does it for sociological and historical grounds that we'll get to in another episode. But what about the judgment sentimentalisms, where sentimentalism is a thing about moral judgment? Well, there's a couple of different things here. There's non-cognitivists, and we're going to get into in another episode specifically the theories of A.J. Ayer and C.L.R. Stevenson. Before I get into MacIntyre and Philippa Foot's argument against this, which I actually am sympathetic for, I want to make sure you understand the debate here, right? So this is a view that to think X is wrong is at least the part that have a negative sentiment towards X, or perhaps have a higher order positive attitude towards a negative sentiment towards X. But this leads to non-cognitivism. You're not thinking this through, you're feeling it. Now, again, we have to accept a fundamental distinction between feelings and thoughts, that someone like, thoughts are reasons, which someone like Hume actually rejects as part of Hume's explanatoriness. But for logical positivists and post-logical positivists in the middle of the 20th century, this was generally just assumed to be true. So they would call this internalism. So, the arguments for internalism, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I will link this article in the show notes. Moral judgments are intrinsically at least defensively motivating, meaning like you defend your own moral sentiments. 2, only non-cognitive psychological states, non-cognitive here meaning states that aren't reason, they don't have a rationality like math, or they're not based on facticity like facts. And this way of discussing things is unique to analytic philosophy. But anyway, only non-cognitive psychological states with the world to mind direction of the world to mind direction of fit are intrinsically motivating. Beliefs which have a mind to world direction do not motivate. So this is the Humean theory of motivation. So moral judgments are at least in part constituted by non-cognitive psychological states. All right. Now, let's talk about the premises here. And we have to get into these kind of formal arguments. One, the first premise is that there's an internal connection between moral judgment and motivation. 2, the second premise is a thesis in philosophy of mind. Some moral states, like descriptive beliefs, represent how things are and have a direction of the mind to world, direction of fit. Other moral states are not descriptive. They have a propositional content as beliefs. So if you want, so they have a so they have a mind to world definition of fit as well. So emerging from the mind and applying to the world, as opposed to things that are world to mind, like things that you observe probabilistically, etc. All right. Then lastly, moral judgments have non-cognitive, are constituted partially, at least partially, in non-cognitive psychological states. Well, if they are motivated by fitness from mind to world, and that the mind has some things in it that are at least defensively motivating, if not absolutely motivating, then moral judgments are not really about logical reasons or facts. They are about either non-cognitive states or subjective states. Now, subjectivists and non-cognitivists aren't the same thing, which is confusing too. Okay. So, that leads to non-cognitivism. I'm going to come back to non-cognitivism because just explaining to you its propositions, I think, doesn't necessarily explain it. Once I go into the works of A.J. Ayer and C.L. Stevenson and explain the terminology a little more, it will make more sense. Now, one thing you'll notice about this is that all these assume the individual subject with very little social or historical context, even though at least in the Humean sympathy sentiments one, there is a kind of natural relationality to it. But notice that there's no history to this. These sentiments are assumed to be pretty ahistorical. They develop in the individual. If there is any history, it is just biological history, etc. All right. Now, what about cognitive sentimentalism, which is another kind of judgment sentimentalism? Well, that's just that that's subjectivism. All right. So what do subjectivists believe? Well, that our moral statements are just subjective states, and they're basically aesthetic. All right. Now, when I get into A.J. Iyer and C.L. Stevenson in the next episode, this will make more sense by what I mean by this, the difference between non-cognitivism and subjectivism. But subjectivism is basically that morality is subjective based on the values that I intrinsically hold, and I hold them for reasons of intersubjective states that are motivated partially by things beyond my control. There are kind of two views of this: speaker subjectivism and ideal dispensationalism. I don't really want to go into that. I just want you to know that they exist. All right. Now we can talk about all these things. These are the formal emotivist paradigms. And I don't know that you just listening to me explain them to you, even if you go and read the Stanford Encyclopedia article, that they totally break down what's actually going on here. All right. One of the things that MacIntyre and co are going to suggest, and we'll get to them in a couple episodes, is that moral sentimentalism and emotivism actually also happen to utilitarians and deontologists because their prepositions end up being absurd. And so how you kind of weight what you put into either the deontological rules or what you put into the what counts as a utility, and what counts as a subject of which you're maximizing the utility of, ends up still being basically subjective, meaning that the quote individual rational modes of morality end up looking like moral sentimentalism or emotivism too, which is why MacIntyre says, despite the attempt to overcome these emotivist theories, moral nihilism is the belief that there's no meaningful claims of objectivity or truth value to moral statements. It's effectively both subjectivism and non-cognitivism could be moral nihilism. You just calling it moral nihilist is to say that you're denying that there's any real substance to morality. A non-cognitivist or a sentimentalist might deny that there's rational substance, but it still might be worth defending, right? But the threat of moral nihilism kind of freaks people out. But according to MacIntyre, is these kind of individualistic views of morality pretty much still end up functioning the same way as emotivism or neo-sentimentalism because they are individual focused and they're ahistorical, and they try to live by reducing things to either emotive states, simple emotive states in the case of emotivism, and we'll get into that, or utility as a singular rule, or deontology, reducing it to a singular rule of which you can live by, thus reducing the possibility of conflict, but also removing historical thinking and sociological thinking from the development of morality, which MacIntyre actually thinks is implied by more ancient modes of morality. Now, if you found this all very abstract, I hope in the next couple of issues in this solo to make it clearer. The reason why I'm doing this as a solo and not as nailing it down or radical engagements, just to explain this a little bit, is that I think that I'm building up an argument with this, and these first two episodes are mainly just to explain to you what these categories are in the formal sense, then in the kind of specific thinker sense, and then in the informal sense. So when I lay out my interpretation of Philippa Foot and Alasdair MacIntyre, and why I think it's important, and why I think even most things that don't think they're emotivist actually are, you will have the context and the understanding for what the formal, criteria has been and why this is such a debate in meta-ethical theory. For those of you who don't know what meta-ethics is, it's just the theories of how ethics is something you apply. Meta-ethics is how you figure out how you justify your ethical application. All right. I would like to thank some new Khan Ilkahanans. There are at least one more. So I'd like to thank Aaron H. for signing up. And I'd like to thank all my Patreon backers for helping us out here. There's a lot of new material coming out in solos and radical engagements, etc. I have decided to slow down the production of interviews for the main show on the YouTube channel for no other reason than just so I can get the free audio caught up eventually. But to produce series that I can produce a bunch of, create engagements, keep them shorter. You don't have to listen for 3 hours at a time, and you can, engage as you see fit. So hopefully you guys got something out of this. This was a very abstract episode. I think when I talk about the specific thinkers, A.J. Iyer and C.L. Stevenson and that brain of emotivism, what this is in the formal sense may become clearer. So I hope you keep following along here at Varn Vlog and keep on keeping on. And if you want a hint for where we're going, you can pick up After Virtue. I think this is the 3rd edition. And this book is almost as old as me now. Right? When did this first come out? 1981. So I've got a year on it, although it's been republished many times. And my version is from 2010. So we'll talk more about MacIntyre's theories, and I'm going to also lay down where it might be different from MacIntyre. Okay, so just so you can kind of understand where we're going with this, why I talk about it so much, how it relates to politics is not immediately clear. But when I talk about the emotivism, one of the things that emotivists do is it is easy to manipulate a emotivist. And in fact, that's one of the things that MacIntyre sets up, is that he thinks manipulation is fundamental to emotivist modalities of morality, and that they make excuses for them. All right. So we'll be back. Like and subscribe, share alike, hit the bell, find the Patreon if you're interested in more in-depth conversations, Q&As, additional radical engagement episodes, additional archive material, and a few shows that are only released to patrons, such as Diving into the Wreckage full episodes, and sporadically Parallax Vlog with JG Michaels and I get together and talk about a topic. Those are only available behind the paywall. Plus, other shows that used to be paywall only are also available there. There's most of a series on Kohei Sato. We didn't finish it because my co-host on that series is indisposed for several months, but when she comes back, we'll finish it up. We also have reading groups, and I do put some of the reading group material also to the Patreon in audio form, usually about once a month. So there's a lot of material behind the Patreon wall. Usually, so literally, there's something to listen to almost every day. So if you're interested, go check it out. If you're not interested, cool. If you just like the free show, that's fine. We're totally happy with that too. If you would like to review the podcast or leave a comment on the YouTube channel, we'd appreciate that. That's a great way to help out. And you can just share it. All right. And with that note and long digression, we're going to move on. I will see you soon, and we'll get into A.J. Iyer and C.L. Stevenson.